She didn't look scared, and that was the first mistake they made. The flashing red and blue lights cut across the polished surface of the midnight black Mercedes, reflecting off chrome details and casting sharp streaks of color across the quiet suburban street just outside downtown Atlanta. It was just after 8:15 p.m., the kind of evening where the air still carried the warmth of the day, where people walked their dogs, where neighbors glanced out from porches without expecting anything unusual to happen. But tonight, something shifted. The moment Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt with that familiar confidence, the tone of the entire street changed. He had already made up his mind before he even reached the driver's side window. The woman behind the wheel, Vanessa Carter, sat still, both hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The interior of the car was quiet, untouched by the tension building just outside, as if she were sitting in a completely different reality. Brooks tapped on the glass, sharp and impatient, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the stillness of the evening. She lowered the window slowly, the soft hum of the motor almost too gentle for the situation unfolding. "License and registration," he said, his voice clipped, already edged with suspicion. Vanessa didn't reach for anything right away. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, not with fear, not with defiance, but with a kind of calm awareness that seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" Her voice was steady, controlled, almost quiet enough to be mistaken for compliance. But there was something underneath it, something that didn't match the role he had already assigned to her. Brooks let out a short breath, glancing briefly at the car, then back at her. "You fit a description," he replied quickly, though he didn't elaborate, didn't need to in his mind. The words hung in the air, vague and heavy, carrying more implication than explanation. A couple across the street had paused mid-walk, their conversation fading as they turned, their attention toward the scene. A phone appeared in someone's hand. Another set of eyes watched from a half-open front door. Vanessa nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something far beyond his words. Then, without rushing, she reached for her purse, retrieving her license with careful, deliberate movements. No sudden gestures, no raised voice, just precision. She handed it over, and for a brief moment, their fingers nearly touched, but Brooks pulled his hand back quickly, as if even that small contact felt unwelcome. He studied the license longer than necessary, his brow tightening, searching for something that would confirm what he already believed. "Step out of the vehicle," he said finally. The command landed heavier this time. Louder. Final. Vanessa paused, just for a second, not in hesitation, but in calculation. Then she opened the door and stepped out, heels meeting pavement with a soft, controlled click. The cool evening air brushed against her face, but her expression didn't change. Around them, the quiet street had turned into an unspoken audience. Brooks gestured toward the back of the car. "Stand right there." And she did. No resistance, no argument, just stillness. But as she stood there, beneath the flashing lights, something about her presence didn't match the scene. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was patience. The kind of patience that doesn't come from not knowing what's about to happen, but from knowing exactly how it ends. Officer Daniel Brooks circled the car slowly, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement as if each step was meant to assert control, to remind everyone watching who held authority in that moment. But the longer he looked, the more something about the situation refused to settle into place. The vehicle was pristine, not a scratch, not a rushed movement, not a single detail that aligned with the suspicion he was trying to build. And yet he leaned into it harder, because backing down was not something he knew how to do once a decision had already been made. Vanessa remained where he had directed her, standing beside the rear of the car, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, not fixed on him but not avoiding him either, as if she were observing rather than reacting, as if this moment was something she had already seen play out before. The faint sound of a phone camera adjusting focus clicked from across the street, followed by another, and then another, until the quiet neighborhood had turned into a low hum of silent witnesses capturing every second. Brooks glanced briefly at the growing attention, then straightened his posture, his tone sharpening as he spoke again. "Who does this car belong to?" he asked, though the answer was already sitting in his hand. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in a calm acknowledgement of the question's intent. "It is registered to me," she said, her voice even, measured, unaffected by the weight he was trying to place on it. Brooks let out a short, disbelieving breath, shaking his head as if the statement itself confirmed something rather than clarified it. "Step over here," he said, pointing toward the curb, creating more distance between her and the vehicle, more distance between her and any sense of control. She followed without resistance, her heels making that same soft, deliberate sound against the concrete, each step precise, unhurried, almost synchronized with the steady rhythm of her breathing. There was no rush in her movements, no urgency, and that lack of urgency began to shift something subtle in the air. Brooks returned to the driver's side, opening the door and leaning inside, scanning the interior with narrowed eyes, searching for something out of place, something that would justify the scene unfolding, but everything was exactly as it should be, clean, organized, intentional. He stepped back out, closing the door a little harder than necessary, the sound echoing down the street, punctuating the tension. "Stay right there," he repeated, though she had not moved at all. A second patrol car turned the corner at the far end of the block, its lights joining the first, casting overlapping flashes that painted the scene in alternating colors. The presence of another officer should have solidified the authority in the moment, but instead, it seemed to draw more attention, more eyes, more quiet judgment from the growing crowd. Vanessa exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, her gaze lifting briefly toward the sky before returning to the scene in front of her. Then, in a voice barely louder than the hum of the idling engine nearby, she spoke again, not to challenge, not to argue, but to mark the moment. "Officer," she said, waiting just long enough for him to turn toward her, "you are making a decision right now." There was no accusation in her tone, no emotion, just a statement, clear and precise, and for the first time, Brooks did not respond immediately. The silence that followed stretched just a second too long, just enough to be noticed, just enough for the balance in the situation to begin, almost invisibly, to shift. The second patrol car rolled to a slow stop behind the first, its engine humming low as Officer Ryan Keller stepped out, adjusting his radio and scanning the scene with a quick, practiced glance. But his eyes lingered a fraction longer than expected when they landed on Vanessa, not because of what she was doing, but because of what she was not doing. She was not arguing, not pacing, not raising her voice. And in a situation like this, that absence of reaction carried its own kind of weight. "What do we have?" Keller asked, walking up beside Brooks, his tone neutral but alert, already aware that the growing number of bystanders and raised phones meant this was no longer a routine stop. Brooks handed over the license with a subtle shake of his head, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled, but not enough to hide the edge underneath. "Claims the car is hers," he said, glancing back toward Vanessa as if expecting her to contradict him, but she did not move, did not speak, only stood there with that same steady composure that now seemed to draw even more attention. Keller studied the license briefly, then looked up again, his gaze shifting between the vehicle and Vanessa, something unspoken passing through his expression, a hesitation that did not fully form into doubt, but refused to disappear completely. Across the street, a man murmured something under his breath, and another voice responded, low but audible enough to ripple through the small crowd, and suddenly the quiet observation had turned into quiet speculation. Brooks seemed to feel it, the shift in the air, the awareness that this moment was no longer contained, and he straightened, taking a step closer to Vanessa. "I am going to ask you one more time," he said, louder now, projecting authority not just to her, but to everyone watching. "Is this vehicle legally yours?" Vanessa met his gaze without flinching, her voice calm, clear, and measured in a way that carried further than his raised tone. "Yes, it is," she said, and then after a brief pause, she added, "and everything you are doing right now is being documented." The words landed differently than anything she had said before, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, as if they carried a meaning that extended beyond the moment. Brooks let out a short, dismissive laugh, though it came a fraction too quickly, a fraction too forced. "Documented?" he repeated, glancing briefly at the phones pointed in his direction before looking back at her. You think that changes anything? Vanessa did not respond right away, and in that silence, something subtle shifted again, something that could not be seen, but could be felt in the tightening posture of the officers, in the way Keller's grip on the license loosened slightly as he looked at her again, more carefully this time. No, she said finally, her voice almost quiet enough to be mistaken for indifference. It does not change what you have already done. The statement did not accuse, did not escalate, but it lingered in the space between them, precise and intentional. A faint breeze moved through the street, rustling leaves and carrying the distant sound of traffic from a main road a few blocks away, grounding the moment in something ordinary, something that contrasted sharply with the tension building here. Brooks shifted his weight, his confidence still present but no longer as absolute, as if the foundation beneath it had developed a hairline crack. Keller glanced at him, then back at Vanessa, and for the first time, there was a question in his eyes, not directed at her, but at the situation itself. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and in that stillness, it became clear that she was not waiting for permission, not waiting for understanding, but waiting for something else entirely, something that had not arrived yet, but was already on its way. The distant sound came first, low and almost indistinguishable from the background noise of the city, but it grew steadily, the smooth hum of a powerful engine cutting through the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood, and before anyone could fully register it, a black SUV turned the corner at the far end of the street, moving with purpose, not fast, not aggressive, but deliberate in a way that immediately shifted the attention of every person watching. Officer Brooks noticed it a second later, his head turning slightly, his posture tightening just enough to betray a flicker of uncertainty, while Officer Keller followed the movement with his eyes, instinctively stepping half a pace back as the vehicle approached. The SUV slowed as it neared the scene, its headlights casting a steady white glow that replaced the flashing red and blue in brief intervals. And then it came to a controlled stop just behind the patrol cars, engine still running, presence undeniable. No one spoke. The air held its breath. The driver's door opened first, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, his expression focused, his movements efficient, followed by another figure from the passenger's side, equally composed, equally precise, and without raising their voices, without rushing, they walked forward with a quiet authority that did not need to be announced. Brooks straightened instinctively, adjusting his stance as they approached, his earlier certainty now layered with something else, something less defined. "Can I help you?" he asked, the question formal but edged with caution. The man in the suit did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved past Brooks, landing directly on Vanessa, and in that moment, the entire dynamic of the scene shifted in a way that no one could fully explain, but everyone could feel. Vanessa did not move. She did not smile. She did not react at all. But there was a subtle change, something in the way her shoulders settled, in the way her gaze held steady, as if a clock she had been quietly watching had just reached the exact moment she had been waiting for. The second suited figure reached into his jacket and produced a badge, holding it up just enough for Brooks and Keller to see, the metallic surface catching the light briefly before lowering again. "We will take it from here," he said, his tone calm, controlled, and absolute, leaving no space for debate. Brooks blinked, his eyes shifting from the badge to Vanessa and back again, trying to process the sudden turn of events, trying to reassemble a situation that no longer fit the narrative he had built just minutes earlier. "Take what from here?" he asked, though his voice had lost its earlier edge, replaced now by something closer to confusion. The suited man took a step closer, his gaze steady, unwavering. "This stop," he said simply. A silence followed, heavier than any before it, stretching across the scene as the weight of those words settled in. Keller looked down briefly at the license still in his hand, then back up at Vanessa, and for the first time, recognition flickered, not fully formed, but enough to change the way he stood, the way he held himself. Brooks remained where he was, but the ground beneath his certainty had shifted, and he could feel it, even if he could not yet name it. Vanessa finally moved, just slightly, her gaze lifting from Brooks to the suited man, and with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she spoke, her voice calm, measured, and unmistakably certain. "I believe they have already done enough." And in that moment, It was no longer a question of what was happening, but of how much had already been set in motion long before the lights ever flashed behind her car. Officer Brooks felt it before he understood it, that quiet collapse of control that does not come with noise but with realization, the kind that settles in slowly and refuses to leave. His eyes moved from the suited man back to Vanessa, and for the first time since the stop began, he truly looked at her, not as a situation, not as a suspicion, but as someone who had been entirely aware of everything from the very beginning. "What is this?" he asked, his voice no longer carrying the same certainty. The question directed outward, but rooted in something internal, something unraveling. The suited man did not raise his voice, did not step closer than necessary, but his presence filled the space with a different kind of authority, one that did not need flashing lights or sharp commands to be understood. "This," he said calmly, "is a monitored interaction that is now part of an active federal review." The words did not land all at once. They settled piece by piece, each one heavier than the last. Brooks blinked, his jaw tightening slightly as he tried to process what that meant, while Keller's posture shifted almost immediately, his shoulders lowering just a fraction as the weight of the situation became clearer to him faster than it did to his partner. Vanessa remained still, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, but now there was context to it. Now there was meaning behind that calm that had seemed so out of place just minutes ago. The second suited figure stepped forward, his tone equally controlled. "Miss Carter," he said, with a level of respect that had been entirely absent from the scene until now. "We have everything we need." Brooks's eyes snapped back toward Vanessa at the sound of her name, the formal recognition of it hitting harder than anything else that had been said. "Everything?" he repeated, almost under his breath, as if the word itself might change if he said it differently. Vanessa finally shifted her weight, just slightly, turning her body a fraction toward the suited men, but her eyes remained on Brooks. "From the moment you activated your lights," she said, her voice calm and precise. "Every action, every word, every decision has been recorded, cross-referenced, and time-stamped." There was no anger in her tone, no need for it, because the weight of what she was saying did not require emotion to be understood. Brooks glanced instinctively at his body camera, then at the phone still pointed in his direction, and for a brief second, the realization crossed his face in a way that could not be hidden, that this was no longer a moment he could control, no longer a situation he could reshape. Keller looked down at the license in his hand, then stepped forward and returned it to Vanessa without being asked, his movements careful now, deliberate in a different way than before. "Ma'am," he said quietly, the shift in tone unmistakable. Vanessa accepted it with a small nod, not acknowledging the change directly, but not ignoring it either. The suited man reached into his jacket again, this time retrieving a small device, holding it up briefly before speaking. "Independent oversight recording," he explained, though no one had asked, initiated prior to contact. The implications settled heavily over the scene, threading together everything that had seemed disconnected just moments ago. Brooks took a step back, not out of instruction, but out of instinct, his earlier posture replaced by something uncertain, something unsteady. The crowd across the street had gone almost completely silent now, their phones still raised, but the energy had shifted from curiosity to realization. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxed, not from relief, but from completion, as if the moment had reached exactly where it had always been heading. Then, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she said the one thing that reframed everything. "You were never stopping a car," she said, her eyes steady on Brooks. "You were stepping into a test." And in that moment, the silence that followed was no longer empty, but full of understanding, the kind that arrives too late to change what has already been done. The words lingered in the air long after Vanessa spoke them, not because they were loud, but because they left no room for interpretation, and for a brief moment, no one moved. Not Brooks, not Keller, not even the suited men who had already taken control of the situation. It was as if the entire scene had paused just long enough for the truth to settle into every corner of it. Officer Brooks shifted his stance again, but this time it was not to assert control, it was to regain balance, to find something solid beneath a situation that had quietly slipped beyond his reach. "A test," he repeated, his voice lower now, not defensive, not confrontational, but searching, as if saying the words out loud might somehow reduce their weight. Vanessa did not answer immediately, and in that silence, the suited man stepped forward, his tone calm but unmistakably final. A pattern review, he clarified, his eyes steady on Brooks. Part of a broader federal oversight initiative evaluating field conduct during discretionary stops. Each word was precise, deliberate, and carried a level of authority that did not need to be emphasized to be understood. Brooks exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the pavement before lifting again, but the confidence that had once defined his posture was no longer there, replaced now by something quieter, something more uncertain. Keller stood slightly behind him, his expression more contained, but his earlier hesitation had fully formed into awareness, and he remained still, choosing not to interrupt, choosing instead to observe what this moment had become. Across the street, the small crowd had grown, but the energy had shifted completely, the phone still raised, but now capturing something different, not a confrontation, not a spectacle, but the quiet unraveling of a decision made too quickly. Vanessa adjusted her stance slightly, not to move away, not to disengage, but to face the situation fully, her posture still composed, still grounded, as if nothing about this outcome surprised her. This was never about the car, she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach both officers without effort. It was about judgment. The statement landed with a different kind of weight, one that did not accuse but revealed, one that did not escalate but clarified. Brooks looked at her again, and this time, there was no assumption left in his gaze, no narrative to hold on to. Only the reality of what had unfolded. The suited man glanced briefly at his colleague, then back at the officers. Internal documentation will follow, he said, his tone measured, along with administrative review procedures. The phrasing was formal, but the implication was clear enough without explanation. Keller nodded once, subtly, as if acknowledging something that had already been decided beyond this moment. Brooks remained still, his hands resting at his sides, no longer directing, no longer commanding, just standing in the aftermath of a choice that could not be undone. Vanessa took a slow breath, her gaze steady, and for the first time since the stop began, there was a trace of something softer in her expression, not satisfaction, not relief, but resolution, the quiet recognition that what needed to be seen had been seen. Then, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she said, "The hardest part about power is not having it." She paused just long enough for the words to settle before continuing. "It is knowing how to use it when no one is watching." And as the flashing lights continued to reflect off the polished surface of the car, the scene no longer felt like an interruption in the evening, but like a moment that would echo far beyond the street where it happened, not because of what was taken, but because of what had been revealed. The flashing lights continued to pulse against the quiet homes lining the street, but their meaning had changed, no longer signaling authority, but marking the place where something irreversible had just unfolded. And as the suited men stepped slightly aside to confer in low, controlled voices, the space between Vanessa and the officers widened in a way that did not require movement to be felt. Officer Keller was the first to shift, taking a small step back, his hands now resting loosely at his sides, his posture no longer rigid, no longer anchored in certainty, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood that whatever came next would not be decided here, not by him, not by anyone standing on that pavement. Brooks remained where he was, but the stillness around him was different now, heavier, pressing in from all sides, amplified by the quiet attention of every person watching, by every lens capturing a moment that had already slipped beyond his control. He looked at Vanessa again, but there was no longer a question in his expression, no suspicion, only the realization of what had been assumed and what had been wrong. Vanessa met his gaze without hesitation, her presence unchanged, steady, grounded, not elevated by the reveal, not diminished by what had happened, simply constant, as if the truth had always been enough on its own. The suited man returned, stepping forward with the same measured composure, a tablet now in his hand, its screen glowing faintly in the dimming light. "Officer Brooks," he said, his voice even, "you will be required to submit a formal statement within 24 hours, and you are advised to preserve all related records. The instruction was delivered without emotion, but it carried finality, the kind that did not invite response. Brooks nodded once, almost automatically, the motion small but unmistakable, as if something inside him had shifted from resistance to recognition. Keller glanced briefly at him, then back at the suited man, and gave a similar nod, quieter, but just as deliberate. Across the street, a woman lowered her phone slowly, her expression thoughtful now, no longer curious, no longer entertained, but reflective, as if she understood she had witnessed more than a roadside stop. Vanessa turned slightly, her attention moving away from the officers and toward the black SUV, but she did not leave yet, not immediately, as if there was one final moment that needed to settle before she stepped away from it entirely. The breeze moved again, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and warm pavement, grounding the scene in something ordinary, even as everything about it had shifted. Brooks finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, not directed at anyone in particular, but still heard. "I thought I was doing my job," he said, the words simple, unguarded. Vanessa paused, then turned back just enough to face him again, her expression calm, but now carrying a trace of something deeper, not judgment, not approval, but clarity. "You were making a choice," she said, her voice steady. "And that is always part of the job." The statement did not challenge him, did not correct him, but it reframed everything in a way that could not be ignored. The suited man gave a small nod toward Vanessa, a quiet signal that it was time, and she acknowledged it with the same subtle precision that had defined her every movement since the beginning. She stepped toward the SUV, her heels meeting the pavement with that same soft, deliberate rhythm, and as she reached the door, she paused one last time, her gaze lifting briefly across the scene, not searching, not lingering, but taking in what had been revealed. Then she entered the vehicle, the door closing with a quiet finality that contrasted sharply with the flashing lights still reflecting across its surface, and as the engine carried it forward, slowly, deliberately, the space it left behind felt different, not empty, but changed, as if something unseen had been brought into view, something that would not fade once the lights were gone. The street slowly began to return to its natural rhythm, but something intangible remained, something that did not disappear with the fading echo of the departing SUV, and as the flashing lights from the patrol cars continued to reflect off windows and quiet lawns, their presence now felt out of place, like a scene that had already ended but had not yet been cleared. Officer Keller moved first, walking back toward his cruiser with measured steps, his mind no longer on procedure, but on reflection, replaying each moment in quiet sequence, each decision now carrying a different weight than it had just minutes before. He opened the door, paused, then looked back once more at Brooks, not with judgment, not with distance, but with a kind of silent acknowledgement that what had happened would follow them both beyond this street. Brooks remained near the rear of the vehicle, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders slightly lowered, as if the uniform itself carried more weight now than it had earlier in the evening. The voices of the suited men were low and controlled as they finalized their notes, their presence steady but no longer central, because the moment that mattered had already passed, recorded, secured, and understood. Across the street, the small crowd began to disperse, conversations starting quietly, not excited, not loud, but thoughtful, as people lowered their phones and returned to their routines with something new in their expressions, something that suggested they had seen more than they expected. Brooks finally turned, walking slowly toward his cruiser, each step deliberate, each movement stripped of the urgency that had once defined him, and as he reached for the door, he paused, his reflection caught briefly in the window, the flashing lights painting across his face in alternating colors, highlighting the shift that had taken place within him. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to reconcile the image he saw with the one he had carried before, but there was no easy alignment, no quick resolution. Keller closed his own door and sat inside, hands resting on the steering wheel, not starting the engine, just sitting in the quiet space, allowing the silence to settle, allowing the reality of the situation to fully reach him. The suited men returned to the SUV, their task complete, their role finished not with noise, but with quiet certainty, and as their vehicle pulled away, The street felt different again, not because of who had left, but because of what had been revealed. Brooks finally got into his cruiser, the door closing with a muted sound, and for a moment, he did not move, his hands resting on the wheel just as Keller's had been, his gaze fixed forward but unfocused, caught somewhere between the present and the realization that had just taken hold. The radio crackled softly in the background, a routine call, a distant voice, a reminder that the world had not stopped, that the job continued, that decisions would still be made, moments would still unfold, and yet, something about this one would not be easily set aside. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than expected, and turned the key, the engine coming to life with a low hum that sounded almost unfamiliar now. The lights dimmed, the street returned to normal, but the silence that followed carried meaning, the kind that does not fade with time, the kind that stays, not as a punishment, but as a reminder. Because sometimes, the moment that changes everything does not come with chaos or noise, but with clarity, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The next morning did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, like most consequences do. Unfolding behind closed doors, inside offices where decisions are written instead of spoken, and as the city moved through its routine, something else was already in motion, something that had begun the moment the lights flashed the night before. Officer Daniel Brooks sat alone at a small desk, the early sunlight filtering through the blinds casting thin lines across the surface in front of him, and for the first time in a long time, there was no urgency in his posture, no rush to move, no assumption guiding his next step, only stillness and the weight of reflection. The uniform he wore felt the same, but it did not carry the same certainty, and as he looked down at the blank report in front of him, the words did not come as easily as they once had. Each sentence required thought, each detail demanded honesty, and that alone was unfamiliar. Across the building, Officer Keller stood near a window, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, his gaze distant, not fixed on the parking lot below, but on the memory of the night before, replaying it not as a sequence of actions, but as a series of choices, small moments that had passed quickly but now felt permanent. The department itself moved as it always did, radios crackling, doors opening and closing, conversations passing in low tones, but beneath that routine, there was a shift, subtle but present, the kind that does not announce itself, but is felt by those who understand what has changed. Somewhere else, in a quiet federal office, the footage was being reviewed, every second examined with precision, not to create a story, but to understand one, and within that process, the truth did not need interpretation, it stood on its own, clear, complete, and undeniable. Vanessa Carter stood near a large window overlooking the city, her reflection faint against the glass as she watched the morning unfold below, the same streets, the same movement, the same rhythm, and yet she knew that for some, it would not feel the same again. She did not smile, did not celebrate, because this was never about victory, never about proving a point. It was about something quieter, something deeper, the kind of accountability that does not arrive with noise, but with clarity. She turned slightly as one of the suited men approached, a folder in his hand, his expression composed. "It is already being processed," he said simply. Vanessa nodded once, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "Good," she replied, not with satisfaction, but with resolve. Because this was never just one stop, never just one officer, never just one moment. It was part of something larger, something that required patience, precision, and the willingness to let the truth unfold exactly as it was meant to. Back at the station, Brooks finally picked up his pen, the silence around him heavier than any noise. And as he began to write, there was no attempt to reshape what had happened, no effort to soften it. Only the recognition that some moments do not need interpretation, only acknowledgement. And somewhere between the lines he wrote and the memory he could not ignore, a realization settled in, quiet but permanent, the kind that does not fade with time. Because he thought he was in control of the moment, he thought he understood what he was seeing, but that day, the moment was watching him, and the truth did not need to raise its voice to be heard.